Okay, so I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone, wherever you're dialing in from today. So I'd like to welcome you all to a first of many webinars which I'll be hosting. First of many will be on validation, on the subject of validation. If I can somebody possibly wave a hand and put a thumbs up just to let me know that they can see the screen and hear me okay? If I can get somebody to do that. You should be able to see my screen. Wonderful. Thanks very much. So that's affirmative. Great. So I'll give you a quick introduction just about myself, and then I'll move on to the subject of process validation. So my name's Adnan Ashfaq. I'm your host and presenter today, founder of Simply Medica. I've been in the medical devices industry for over 25 years. The first 12 years or so of that 25-year journey in medical devices was holistically in validations. I was working as a process validation engineer. I started off, in fact, in the telecommunications industry and then moved over to the automotive industry for 2 to 3 years before actually making my introduction into medical devices. I started with Johnson & Johnson in 1999 as a validation engineer. And I worked for a number of other companies, including some pharma companies also, including Quintiles, Wyeth, Pfizer, and a few others to name, which also gave me quite an exposure into validation from the pharmaceutical industry as well as the medical device industry. So some of you will know that there's an overlap between the two industries. They're both heavily regulated industries, which require a lot of rigor involved in the manufacturing process. So my own background is as a manufacturing engineer. That's my bias. I graduated as a manufacturing engineer, so I understand the manufacturing industry very well. Process validation is akin to many different manufacturing processes. Some of these can be largely and heavily automated processes, or sometimes semi-automation and even manual tasks, which need some level of validation involved. So what I'm going to be doing is over the coming weeks and months, I'll just switch over to the view. We'll be looking at the overview of process validation today, and then subsequently we'll be looking at qualification, IQ, OQ, PQ. So some of you might be familiar with those terms. We'll also be looking at packaging validation. We'll be looking at equipment software validation, sampling and statistics, sterilization validation, and possibly some other areas which have not been named, such as clean room validation, and facilities and utilities and what's required in that. So we're really looking at quite an intense program over the weeks and the months. For those that can join regularly, that's wonderful. If not, these will be going on to the website, and also there's a YouTube channel that will be posted as well, which will have these recordings. So hopefully that's something that you can benefit from in the future. So I'm just going to move on. So in terms of putting this into context, I'm going to give you some definitions and background to validation. So ISO 13485 contextualizes validation with the following. 7.5.6 is the specific clause which looks at the requirement for validation. It sits under the production clause 7.5, which then requires the validation of processes for production and service provision, where it states that the organization shall validate any processes for production and service provision where the resulting output cannot be or is not verified by subsequent monitoring or measurement. Now, this is interesting to note, that it states where it cannot be verified. So the key thing is that there may be a lot of verification taking place within the manufacturing process, and where there's no verification, that's when validation should take place. And verification can be a very costly and very timely exercise. It can be heavily manual, where there's tasks which are being 100% verified, and those would be ultimately replaced by a validated process, which has been quality assured prior to the actual QC inspection taking place. So we'll explore some of those ideas a bit more. Validation shall demonstrate the ability of these processes to achieve planned results consistently. So that's been highlighted in red for a purpose, because it's not to look at validation or results that are meeting predetermined requirements as a one-off. It's looking at consistency. Then the standard goes on to state that the organization shall document procedures for validation of processes, including the following: so define criteria, equipment qualification in the personnel, looking at the qualification of the personnel, resources, use of specific methods, procedures and acceptance criteria, as appropriate statistical techniques with rationale for sample sizes. So as I said, in the coming weeks and months, we will be exploring that also. Requirements for records, revalidation and approval for changes. And also, importantly, at the bottom here, in the last paragraph, it also mentions that the organization shall document procedures for the validation of the application of computer software used in production and service provision. Now, very often this is an area which is missed, and that's why I've decided to do a separate session on software validation. So it's looking at CSV principles, looking at computer software and what's required in the different types of validation when you're validating software within a manufacturing process, especially when it's heavily automated. And then also further, which is more important also, is the last sentence talks about validation and revalidation, which is proportionate to risk associated with the use of the software. And this is why it's important to do a risk assessment and an impact assessment, and to assess the risk which the software or the failure of the software would possibly present. So we're going to be exploring that in the coming weeks and months also. And of course, records should always be there. We also then have the US FDA 820.75, the FDA's process validation definition. I'm not going to go read this all entirety. It's there. You can take the reference. 820.75 is the process validation clause from the FDA Part 820. And as most of you know, that the FDA are now also recognizing the QMSR, which is the ISO 13485. So the definition that we looked at in slightly more detail prior to the FDA clause is what's going to be explored more even by the FDA. So that 820.75 will ultimately will be superseded by the ISO clause 7.5.6. So importantly, looking at the schematic, it's to look at user requirements, which then allow us to design the machine, which will then ultimately lead towards some level of equipment acceptance, where there's tests that will be performed. There's an important element of training and experience that's required when these validations are being performed and when the equipment is being validated. We need to go through the motions of qualification, which is, as we said before, IQ, OQ, PQ, installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification. That will also then, once the qualification is completed, a validation summary report should be written up to complete the validation and to state that everything has been accepted. A periodic review should also be in place, as you may have noticed that in the ISO clause that I just read, it talked about revalidation. So there should be some provision for periodic review. Now that could be every 12 months, or it may be on a case-by-case basis, depending on, again, the criticality and the risk posed by the equipment or the process. Statistical sampling and testing. Of course, we need to look at things like Six Sigma, process capabilities, anything which is to look towards fine-tuning the process to make sure that it's yielding a higher overall good yield and less rejects. And that's something that we try to build in at the beginning of the process before it's handed over to production, before manufacturing takes place. Knowledge and experience, of course, understanding of the process, an understanding of the equipment being validated, and also understanding the regulations, the goalposts, what's required. We have different legislations. We've got the FDA requirements. We've got ISP GAMP, which some of you may be familiar with, Good Automated Manufacturing Practice. We'll also be touching upon that in the time to come. And then also the specific jurisdictions may have other requirements. So it's also important to look at wherever commercialization is taking place of the devices, and that's something that the engineering team should work closely with market access, which markets are being accessed, and do they have any specific requirements over and above the ISO, over and above the FDA guidance and the GAMP guidance. There may be some other requirements. So the question, what is validation? So we looked at the definitions earlier. We've got the FDA, we've got the there's also a WHO definition, and there's other definitions also. ISO 13485 we've looked at, and we're focusing a bit more on that 7.5.6, which again states in inverted commas, establishing documented evidence which provides a high degree of assurance that a specific process will consistently produce a product meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. I mean, that whole sentence there, every part of that is so important, whether it's high degree of assurance, whether it's a specific process that will consistently produce the product and the predetermined specifications, because you cannot validate something without predetermined specifications and what the acceptance criteria is. So we must know what the acceptance criteria is that we're looking for. Otherwise, we don't know what a pass-fail criteria may be. So who is an authority? So we've mentioned FDA, I mentioned ISO, but I didn't mention the other jurisdictions, because FDA, although it has the regulations, it is an authority. The US, that's the US authority. But there's also the World Health Organization, and in the United Kingdom we have the MHRA, and Europe we have for the EU Commission we have also the medical device regulations. Although the MHRA and the EU MDR regulations don't actually tell us that much about validation, how to do validation in so much detail. The FDA actually have a lot more guidance documents produced for validation, for process validation, and also the World Health Organization do have some guidance documents on this. So you might be thinking, if you come from an experience of a background of validation, you have experience in different types of validation. We've talked about computer validation, process validation. There's also test lab validation, procedure validation, equipment validation, and building facility validation. So I'm not looking at design validation here. Design validation looks at an entirely different clause, 7.3 of the ISO 13485. We will look at that also in the future as part of design control activities. We're now only focusing on validation. So why do we validate? We have to ensure that the product is safe, that the quality and the efficacy of the product which is being exposed to the general public is of high quality. We're also at the same time fine-tuning processes. We're ensuring that there's a high product quality and customer satisfaction, and we're also ensuring that it's compliance with industry standards. It's also astute business practice, and it minimizes potential for product recall. So outcomes of validation, we should be looking towards regulatory success, cost reductions. So some of the things that we look at within regulatory success, of course, we want to have successful inspections. We want to have clean audits. We want to make sure that we've got approved products. We have the ability to export. We also want to make sure that we have got fuel rejects when we are manufacturing. There's longer equipment life, and we're operating within specifications. We're also reducing in-process testing. So going back to the point of 100% verification, we don't want to be verifying product where we've validated the process in advance. So the quality assurance is built into the manufacturing process rather than looking at the output, which is where you would do 100% verification of the output and making sure that the finished product meets a predetermined specification and is being inspected 100%. The whole aspect of validation allows us to do some level of sample testing. So because we would be building in the confidence into the manufacturing process at an early stage, it then means that it would allow us to have that confidence level, and also especially if we're applying CPK values, process capability, also then that gives us some confidence that the process is also stable, it's been fine-tuned. We've also, if we apply Six Sigma principles, and we have a high process capability expectation, the data is normalized. The data that we actually look at when we analyze the statistics, it proves that the actual process itself is actually within very tight control. That gives us a lot of confidence in the manufacturing process, which will lead ultimately to cost reductions and fewer problems. One of the important things to remember also is that we're also looking at maintenance and calibration. We do that as part of the qualification process, which we'll look at also in more detail when we look at the qualification. It's important to also note where this kind of hits home, where we have warnings and warning letters coming from the regulatory authorities. Specifically here, we have a letter from the FDA. These are available in the public domain, where the FDA here, going back in 2009, talk about failures for a number of things, but the ones highlighted in red are more to do with failure of validation, where there's procedures and identification, documentation, validation, which have been failed to have been proven against. Here it's talking about 820.30, which is actually more to do with the design validation, but it also looks at validation as a whole. And then point 6 here, looking at validation of computer software. So as I said before, sometimes this can be a hidden enemy where software has been missed within the validation process, and we look at the outputs of validation and we don't actually look at the software and the computer software itself, whether that's embedded in firmware or whether it's running standalone from an operating system, has to have been challenged. Again, proportionate to risk. You know, what is the risk involved in the software and what it's trying to do? What is the objective? If it's some kind of package which is observing statistics of the operational process of the manufacturing, then the risk of that could be a lot lower than something which is in direct control of the operation process, which would be something like firmware, where the firmware is designed to operate the equipment, and by design, you know, it may actually cause some failures within the failure of the design, or there's some this, and we need to make sure that there's a fail-safe in place, and that's what the computer software validation allows us to do. So when do we validate? When we've got requirement of a licensed product. So when we say a licensed product, that could be a drug device combination, because it's got active ingredients in it. It may also be just for a licensed product for a device which you're looking to regulate, which is a medical device which is being legally commercialized. Then we have to do validation of the process. We also have to look at when there's review of equipment which has been running historically, and many times we have situations where there's been equipment which has been installed but never validated. To improve, also to introduce better control to historical process, it may be because of a customer complaint that you're doing some investigation and we end up doing some validation because of that. We also look at it because of the requirement of a new process. It might be because of validation regulations. It may be new regulations. It might be because of company policy, and also referring back to your user requirement specification. So as I said before, there's a knowledge base requirement of validations. There's an expectation that there is some experience and knowledge behind validation, whoever's doing the validation, but it's ultimately is driven by quality assurance because it comes from the regulations and it's requested by the ISO standard, and usually that sits with either the regulatory department or quality assurance. It's supported by production and supported by engineering. So we need to make sure that we've got a window of opportunity to do to perform a validation, especially when you have retrospective validations. Say if you have equipment which has been running historically, it's never been validated, and we need to validate that process. But we need to have manufacturing buy-in because we're manufacturing job lots or batches of product through the system, through the normal production planning system, but we need some time to be able to book the equipment off and ensure that we have the availability and capacity of the equipment to do validation. So it's really important to work together as a team. So doing teamwork with engineering, production, and quality, usually that is a sensible approach. And of course, because it's a legal requirement, it would also need to be management driven. So we need to have management buy-in, and that's very, very important. So where do we perform validation? So there's GXP standards, which the X denotes the unknown, where you have GMP for good manufacturing practice, good laboratory practice, good engineering practice, good distribution, and that can also be good documentation practice, and so on. So we need to make sure that we have validation. So then how do we perform validation? A risk assessment needs to be performed. There should be some criticality level assigned, which impacts business interest. You would write a validation plan. You would then have a validation team meeting with all departments involved, meeting and discussing requirements for trialing validation. Now, you might think if you come from an entirely small team, a small manufacturing company, where you might have a handful of you doing everything, well, that then needs to become the team. You just need to have all of the important buy-in. So, like I said before, management, whoever's representing quality, engineering, and production. Now, if you have an overlap between production and engineering, that's fine. But we just need to make sure that we have whoever is taking responsibility for those roles are involved in the validation process. The system owner then would assign the resources for validating the subject. So again, depending if you come from a larger manufacturing organization, there needs to be somebody that's project managing, there needs to be someone from engineering, somebody from production, someone from quality that's assigned on delivering the project, because sometimes the validation that's being performed, there could be a lot of validation, and the processes can be quite complex. So the document is then reviewed, approved, and archived for future regulatory approval, and that can be for submissions, for auditing, etc. As I've said, the emphasis here is there's a department overlap. Validation don't come in the way of production, so there's planning. There's also a knowledge base of standards. The requirements understood. There's experience of validation. You have management support. You should also have, so you need to have operator resources. So if you've got a manufacturing line that you're validating, you need to have the availability and capacity of operators or production supervisor. You need the product for sampling. You need procedures. You need training, work instructions need to be in place. All of those things need to be taken care of before the validation takes place, so that you have a seamless experience in validation. Otherwise, you will come across hiccups. So resources and responsibilities. Manufacturing operators, the senior manufacturing operators would be involved in the execution. That would be running production, running the equipment, because they are experienced in it. Team leaders would be involved in the planning into the production, or line managers to plan, but then also to sign off the protocols and the reports. You need engineers to prepare protocols. You need planners to plan in production, and you need quality assurance to prepare protocols, or that might even be done just by engineering, and the quality assurance might only be reviewing and approving. So that's also fine. So I spoke earlier on about retrospective validation. So retrospective validation is a term which isn't usually favored upon by the FDA because it's usually misunderstood to think that we can accept validation from retrospective batches that have been manufactured. That's not acceptable. What is acceptable is if you have a piece of equipment which has been running historically, then you would need to run the validation as if it was a new system. That's what's meant by retrospective validations. And this happens all the time. You have an authority or an auditor that's come in, they've raised a non-conformance because equipment was not validated or inadequately validated, which for equipment that's been running historically for a number of years in the factory. So then you have to revisit this and then look at this as retrospective validation. On the other hand, if you have brand new equipment, you would be doing prospective validation. The prospective validation is basically where you've got virgin equipment and it's being run for the first time. You've got no historical data to run off. You would then be running all the sequential steps as they should be in the correct order. Now, interestingly, there's also concurrent validation, and this can be a pleasure to many in manufacturing, especially where you've got very expensive product, which can be a very costly exercise to perform validation, because sometimes validation causes a lot of scrap product. The yield is then inspected, it becomes destructive testing involved in it, then you've destroyed the product, you can no longer sell that product. There is an opportunity to do concurrent validation, which means that you could produce a batch which will become saleable only after the tests have proven successful. So you would take a sample from that batch, from the production batch, you would test the sample based on statistical sampling. If it then passes, you could then pass the product, but in the meantime, that production batch must remain in quarantine. It must not be sold until the results have proven to be successful and meet the acceptance criteria. So that's all based on risk. So that then gives us an opportunity to sell the product. We should always be doing a risk assessment to start with, assess each subject using patient risk analysis, use a GMP checklist, write the user requirement specification, or a change control if it's for existing equipment. A definition of risk is based on high criticality. So high risk might be something where there's risk to quality, safety, integrity, and business commercial interests. So such processes that could involve direct contact with the product, like extrusion, welding, injection molding. Medium risk could be product quality, safety, integrity, and business commercial risks, which have indirect contact with product, such as capping machines, check weighers, metal detectors. Or low risk could be where there's no contact with product. There could be shrink wrap machines, printers, labelers, that type of thing. So you can see there is quite clearly a methodology to categorize risk involved in validation with devices based on these definitions. So responsibilities of approvers. So the manufacturing, when they're approving documentation, they should be looking at general errors for raw material usage. Should be looking for product usage, any info, production procedures have been quoted correctly, equipment information has been documented, and then also challenge any testing. Quality assurance, when they're signing off documentation, you should be looking for general errors, compliance, references, statistical accuracy, and also challenge any testing. Engineering, if they're signing off, should also be looking for general errors, but also should be looking for calibration and maintenance accuracy. They should be looking for equipment information, also health and safety, etc. So there could be some other things. And regulatory, may also sign off for general errors or for effects on design dossiers, regulation impacts and changes. So you can see that this way of approving validation documentation can be a little bit onerous, but there is a stake from all of these different departments and roles where they may have a say in the sign-off of the validation to make sure that the validation of the equipment has been done safely and to the correct standards, etc. So the validation process, when we look at the process as a whole, we should be looking at user requirement specifications, right? So what did we order? That's the user requirement specification. Normally, the user requirement specification would go to the supplier, and that's what they would use to build the equipment. You would then have an opportunity to do factory acceptance testing. You can also do site acceptance testing. So you could do site acceptance testing at the supplier build before it's being shipped, and then you do the factory acceptance once it's received within your factory, and you would compare the tests, the results between the site acceptance and the factory acceptance. The other reason for doing that sometimes can be a commercial advantage, because commercially you might only pay the supplier 50% or 40% upon site acceptance, and then the remaining balance would only be paid to the supplier of the equipment after factory acceptance, that you've accepted it and it's passed when it's entered your premises. The reason why, again, is because the number of occasions where I've seen that there's been issues with the supply, it could be something like the crate or the pallet was the incorrect size when it was delivered and shipped to the manufacturing site. It fell off and it damaged the actual equipment. Then when it gets to doing your installation qualification, you suddenly realize that it's failed because it wasn't shipped correctly. The whole point of then staging this is that it gives you the opportunity to check everything stage by stage. So only then, once you've satisfied the FAT, you would then move to installation qualification to check what you're installing. You would then challenge your process windows and operational functionality of the equipment with OQ. We would then check for repeatability and consistency, reliability and consistency and repeatability in PQ. And then we will also do a process validation to challenge the entire process. So that would be end to end. And that may be because you have a line, a manufacturing line, which has several processes within that. Other important phases could also be design of experiments where you could use to optimize the process windows. I'm not going to dwell on that because that's something we will look at a later date. So again, user requirement specifications, we do this because it's a cornerstone. It specifies the supply of what you have. It's the basis of acceptance criteria. The factory acceptance, we do that because it's an opportunity to try before you buy it. It's also your fail-safe. It allows you to remove any teething problems. The IQ we look at to ensure that we have established confidence within equipment and ancillary systems that are installed to the design specifications and documentation. We look at OQ because we want to make sure that we've got the operating windows and we have the confidence in the parameters where there's always drift in manufacture. We then look towards PQ. Once we've established IQ and OQ successfully, we look towards establishing confidence that the equipment is operating consistently and nominal parameters which will be run during production. So these are really, really important things to look at. The PQ very often it can be the most critical part of the validation process. And I've not really talked here about the batches or the number of batches, because typically that can be a big question to what that people have. How many batches do we run? We have a very expensive product. One batch could be several thousands. It's really expensive if we did 3 batches, etc. We always run into these situations, and we have to look at things from a risk perspective. So if we were to look at doing a batch which was let's say one batch, but is there a way that we could actually split it up into three? And the reason why three is often used is because it's a rule of thumb to provide some level of consistency. They often say first is chance, second is by confidence, and third is validation, something along those lines. There's a rule of thumb. The FDA have used it for some time. It's consistent, although there has been some challenges on the number of batches. So we will look at this also at a later date when we look at the qualification in more detail. So the validation life cycle itself should be looking at design and development. So design and development of equipment, testing the equipment, and then looking at operations and maintenance. It continues into day-to-day processes. We have to make sure that it's maintained for quality in future, and it continues until the termination of that process. So the validation must remain live. It's dynamic, and it's not something that would be done as a one-off and then we just forget about it. It's something that must be live, so it's a living system until the termination of that manufacturing process. So when we look at the whole journey of medical device development, so this is looking at end to end, where manufacturing or equipment validation sits within what we would call verification and validation as a phase. And some companies they have different levels of phases when they're developing the medical devices, but typically they could be 4, 5, or 6 different phases. But the verification and validation is when you would typically begin your IQ, OQ, PQ validation, and then when you get ready to do your final validation, you will do full process validation and final process IQ, OQ, because you also have to do a design transfer. So when you're doing your design transfer, you've gone effectively from a design freeze of a medical device into what would be then production from a lab scale prototype manufacture type of environment into full scale production. And that then needs to be challenged from a full scale, now we're in the real world. It's no longer an R&D project. So we need to move into full scale production. So we need to challenge this. So there's also roles and functions involved in the different phases. So there's a role for QA in the design phase to make sure that there's participations in drawings, engineering meetings. There's an input from good manufacturing practice. There's also an assessment of vendor compliance. The vendor that you choose to go with supplier for your supply of the equipment also needs to be approved, and they may need to be audited. They also need to have industry standards to be defined. So there's a very important contribution there from quality assurance. Validation in the design phase also allows for facility and controlled room requirements. So you also need to have a look at, let's say, if you're manufacturing a sterile device, you possibly the equipment that you're validating could be sterile packaging. We also need to look at the control of the room. It doesn't need to be in a clean room, what classification of clean room, etc. So these are all also important external aspects to have a look at from validation, which is not only looking at the equipment itself, but also the environment where the equipment would be residing in. The layouts, the equipment arrangement, utilities, instrumentation placement, calibration, monitoring and control systems, hardware, software, cleaning. So it's a huge process. It's can be quite overwhelming and definitely not something to be done alone. So the validation life cycle, again, ensure that there's appropriate training, protocols are written and executed by the right people. There is an interpretation of the data that needs to take place. You have to create reports. There's planning involved. You have to define the process equipment, define process and procedure specifications. You have to have the level of input for procedures, calibration and maintenance, pre-qualification methods of this method validation. Test method validation is another thing where it's often forgotten about because you may have a very laborious task which is involved in manual input. So this is where we also have to have a look at things like gauge R&R. So methods validation is also important. And then we summarize everything in these summary reports, which then get approved. Basic fundamentals would be when you're going out and setting out to do your validation is planning and making sure that you have good planning, getting organized, making sure that you have a core team, develop your validation policy, the do's and the don'ts, making sure that you've got standards in place, the standard operating procedure that you're following, your quality from your quality management system, making sure that you have the equipment is available, it's in the right situ, utilities are plugged in. So if you need to have compressed air, power, water, those have all been plumbed in correctly. You've got to have the facilities. Also, then ensuring that the computer systems and processes also have been considered for validation. And then you may also have some areas where validation will not be performed, and you need to be prepared to have a justification or rationale which is robust to make sure that you have adequate backing for not performing the validation. And it may not be so simple as because you're doing 100% verification. Now, there's times where you have some processes which have a bit of a black art involved, and it can be quite a bit of science in the control of validating the systems. How do you control the parameters and what parameters? What's the acceptance criteria? There's been occasions where I've had some vendors or clients tweaking the parameters as they're going along. This is very hard to validate because the whole premise of validation is that you have parameters predetermined and they're set throughout the validation, and you don't touch those parameters, and then your validation is based on those parameters. Once you have completed the validation, it's based and fixed on those parameters, and if you were to ever change the parameters, it means you need to revalidate, or you need to look at the risk and assess the risk of that revalidation. So it's important to the organization and understanding these core principles. You should have a master validation plan. That's the foundation of your validation, and that is having an inventory identified of all the equipment that's going to be validated, and then writing up a justification within the master validation plan for things that are not going to be validated, or how it's going to be validated, and the procedure and the process that you'll do for that validation. It's a living document. It's also an auditable document. And really, in fact, it's usually the first document that an auditor will want to have a look at for validation. They'll say, show us your master validation plan or your validation master plan, and they will go from there. They will look through and they will see, usually try and pick out one or two processes, and they would then want to have a look at that in detail to make sure that you've actually performed the process validation for those equipment that have been identified in the master validation plan. And you should also have a revalidation timetable in it, also risk-based. You should also make sure that you've got manpower, costs, and your corporate statement. There has to be a commitment to quality which comes from senior management. You should also have a schedule for that, and that should be maintained. So that is very important to make sure you've got that. So again, some contents for a master validation plan. You could have the introduction, you have responsibilities, you have the project, the facility, the site description. What is the validation approach that you're taking? What's the acceptance criteria for the validation of the equipment? Documentation requirements, which SOPs from your quality management system, your quoting, your schedule, and then manpower, what human resources you need, and then any appropriate appendices. So some important terms to remember as part of the validation overview. A URS, user requirement specification, DQ, design qualification, factory acceptance, FAT, IQ, installation qualification, OQ, operational qualification, PQ, performance qualification, and then change control is to make sure that you maintain your validations. You should then also have a validation review and sign off, and for handover to production, and then VMP, validation master plan, or interchangeably master validation plan, which would be MVP. And I'm just going to wrap up here and summarize. And if there's any questions, we can also take questions in the next few minutes. So to summarize, the user requirements is really the foundation of validation, because again, what we're looking to do from the user requirements is that's the go-to document to understand what did we actually request at the time of manufacturing the equipment from the supplier. Now, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, when I've gone in to do validation for a process which has already been historically embedded into the manufacturing site, there is no user requirement specification. So the question is, do we then retrospectively create a user requirement? Well, there may be little benefit in creating a user requirement specification. I would say it's more beneficial developing a design requirements document, which would then be that the basis of the validation is on the following requirements. So, for example, let's take an example of environment. What type of environment does it need to be in? So, does it need to be in a clean room, or is it okay to be in a dirty environment which is uncontrolled? That's a requirement. So it's useful to put that in a design document, which could be a design requirements document as opposed to user requirements. So once we've got the user requirement or the design requirement in place, that will allow us to have clearly defined the process validation, will then allow us for ensuring equipment testing is done correctly for the functionality, ensuring that the quality assurance is built into manufacture the device, ensuring all steps are carefully planned, and ensure all stages are documented, and in ensuring also all stages are in the correct order as well. So those are all the important terms to consider once we're having a look at process validation. That completes my presentation for today.